She stumbled on a perfectly flat stretch of sidewalk. One moment Elizabeth was walking to lunch, her mind pleasantly adrift. The next, she was captivated by a cascade of blush pink flowers in the artfully arranged window of a flower shop, and then she was falling. The city air rushed past her in a bewildering swoop. The impact with the concrete was sharp and unforgiving. Her sheer stockings tore instantly, revealing knees scraped raw and angry against the gritty pavement. The heels of her hands burned with a fierce stinging pain, as if someone had rubbed salt into the fresh wounds. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't from the physical shock, but from the sting of a different kind of pain. People flowed around her like a river around a stone, their faces averted, their gaits uninterrupted. No one stopped. No one asked if she was all right. But the cruelest blow was the sound that cut through the urban hum, the loud, unrestrained laughter of her own husband. Mark didn't move to help. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood there, watching her, a wide grin on his face, as if her fall were the punchline to a joke only he had heard. "Are you going to camp out there all day?" he asked finally, his amusement fading into irritation as he glanced at his watch. "Our lunch break isn't endless, Liz. I plan on actually eating. If you're comfortable on the ground, I can go ahead. You can just stay." She said nothing. A knot of disbelief and hurt lodged so tightly in her throat she couldn't have formed a word. Mark just grunted, a small dismissive sound, then turned and walked away. Only after he was gone did Elizabeth manage to push herself up, her movements stiff and clumsy. The desire for food was now secondary to the urgent need to clean her wounds. She limped toward the little bistro where they always had lunch. He was already there, having claimed her favourite table by the window. He sat scanning the menu as if nothing had happened. When she walked in, he looked up and gave her a little wave, a gesture of such baffling normalcy it made her stomach churn. Elizabeth pretended not to see him. She walked straight past his table to the quiet refuge of the women's restroom. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights, she dabbed at her bleeding knees with damp paper towels, each touch a fresh reminder of his cruelty. Composing herself, she walked back into the main dining area and chose a small solitary table in the far corner. As she ate her salad, she built a wall in her mind, focusing on the crunch of the lettuce and the taste of the vinaigrette, refusing to let her thoughts stray. When she finished, she left without a word or even a glance in his direction and walked back to the office. They worked for the same marketing firm in different departments. The fluorescent hum of the office seemed to amplify the buzzing in her own mind. It had all started 6 months ago, when she'd been made senior project manager. It was a promotion Mark had also been vying for, and ever since she'd gotten it, the man she married seemed to have been replaced by a bitter, resentful stranger. He had become a constant source of toxic commentary. He criticised everything from the way she ran her team to the clothes she wore at work. At home, his voice would often rise to a shout over the smallest things. The worst were his insinuations, the ugly whispered suggestions that her promotion hadn't been earned, but had been a special favour from her boss. "How dare you even think that, let alone say it?" she asked him once, her heart breaking. "Mark, I'm your wife. I'm the mother of your children." "Oh, God," she'd pleaded another time, stunned by the venom in his eyes. "Has your envy blinded you completely?" She was bewildered by the transformation and utterly lost as to how to fix it. There were moments she was ready to pack a bag for herself and the girls and just walk away. But Mark had a keen, almost predatory sense of her emotional state. Just when she'd reached her breaking point, he would retreat. He'd apologise, his face a mask of shame, and swear it would never happen again. And for a while it wouldn't. But then a director would praise her work in a company-wide email and the cycle would begin anew. "He's just having a crisis, honey. It'll pass. Be patient." Her mother's well-meaning advice echoed in her memory. She could almost feel her mother's hand patting her own, a gesture meant to soothe the pain it couldn't possibly comprehend. "A crisis, Mum? Or is he just angry that my salary is higher now than his?" She'd lamented on their last call. "Before, when I was on maternity leave, he was the sole provider and everything was fine." "Darling, these things happen. You don't throw away such a good relationship over a rough patch." A good relationship. Elizabeth stared blankly at her computer screen, the question hanging in the air around her. Was that what this was? Was that what it had ever been? The honest answer, forming slowly in her heart, was no, it had never been truly good. Except perhaps for that first year. They were fresh out of college then, taking their first tentative steps into adulthood. They had a tiny rented apartment, barely their paychecks and enormous dreams they shared like a secret. The Mark she'd loved then was a different person entirely. Joyful, optimistic, a man who believed in the good of the world and their place in it. Then she got pregnant with Sarah. Life became hard. He threw himself into his work, a frantic energy about him, trying to provide for their growing family. The endless hours, the constant stress, and the weight of responsibility began to curdle his easygoing nature. Elizabeth, in turn, tried to shield him from every other burden. She took on the baby, the cooking, the cleaning, the entire landscape of their domestic life. She had even taken on freelance work at night, writing term papers for college students after putting their daughter to bed. She remembered moving into the spare room with the baby, just so Mark could get a full night's sleep. She'd paced the floor for hours with a crying infant in her arms, her own body humming with exhaustion, all so her husband could rest. A few years later, a small inheritance from a distant relative allowed them to buy a condo. 2 bedrooms, their own space. It felt like a miracle. Elizabeth briefly went back to work, where she was welcomed with open arms. Her old boss was heartbroken when, a year later, she left again for her second maternity leave. "Mark," she had said to him one evening, scrolling through job postings, "my old company has an opening. It's a perfect fit for you and it pays much more than your current job." To her surprise, he listened and got the position. And so Elizabeth had their second daughter, Emily, and drowned once more in the world of motherhood and household management. This time money wasn't tight, but Mark had remained a man perpetually dissatisfied. Now his resentment had a new target. He would taunt her about sitting on his dime, making comments about how her only job was to gain weight watching talk shows while he did all the real work. They fought, of course. Elizabeth had never been the type to suffer such unjust accusations in silence. But in these arguments, her opinion, her reality, held no value for Mark. His words weren't meant for debate. They were a pressure valve for the rage he carried inside him. He'd admitted as much one night, in the middle of a particularly vicious tirade. "Who else am I supposed to vent to?" he'd demanded, his face inches from hers. "My boss, my friends, my mother. You're my wife, Liz. You're supposed to be my safe place to land, to handle my stress. I provide for you and the girls. I think I've earned the right to unwind in my own home, even if you don't like the way I do it." Once she had left, unable to bear it any longer. She'd driven to her mother's house, where for several days she did nothing but cry, letting her mother's gentle presence and care for the girls be a balm on her fractured spirit. They stayed for nearly a month. Then one afternoon Mark appeared on the doorstep. He had called dozens of times, but she never answered. So he had come. He stood there holding a bouquet of stargazer lilies, her favourite. And shopping bags filled with new toys for Sarah and Emily. He spoke of his regret with tears streaming down his face, his voice thick with a sorrow that seemed, at that moment, entirely real. And she forgave him. She did it because her mother, hoping for peace, urged her to. She did it because her daughters, squealing with delight, clung to their father's legs as if he were a long-lost hero. But mostly, she did it because, against all logic, she chose to believe him. For a while the peace held. Mark was gentle, attentive. Elizabeth allowed herself to believe that they had finally turned a corner. They took out a loan for a new family SUV, a loan Mark proudly put in his name only. Emily started kindergarten, and Elizabeth returned to work. A year later she received her promotion, and the storm returned, 3 times as strong. "You couldn't have waited for me," he hissed, leaning over her cubicle wall after he returned from his solitary lunch. The smell of coffee was sharp on his breath. "What was that circus you pulled today? We'll be talking about this at home." Elizabeth didn't turn around, her eyes fixed on the spreadsheet on the screen. She kept typing, but the rhythm of the clicking keys was a counterpoint to the new steady rhythm of a thought that had just begun to form in her mind. It was a clear, quiet, and terrifyingly simple idea, and it took root instantly. She left the office an hour before him. She spoke to her director, citing a sudden migraine, and was met with immediate concern and understanding. She knew Mark would be furious, but as she walked out into the late afternoon sun, she realized, with a sense of profound detachment, that she no longer cared. He came home later than usual, his keys slamming onto the entryway table. He stalked into the living room where she was sitting, his face a thundercloud, ready to burst. "How am I supposed to interpret that today, Liz? I'm waiting for you by the elevators like an idiot, and security tells me you've already gone. Was it so hard to send me a text?" She looked up from her book. "I felt sick, so I asked to leave early," she said, her voice even. "Or, in your opinion, I should have endured a migraine for your convenience?" Something in her tone, a lack of fear he wasn't accustomed to, seemed to catch him off guard. He stared at her for a moment, searching her face for the usual signs of distress, but found none. His angry momentum faltered. "Fine, whatever," he said, his voice calmer now. "Is dinner ready? I'm starving, and I'm sure the girls are too." "The girls are spending the night at my mum's," she said, closing her book. "And there is no dinner. I haven't cooked." And then he broke. He roared, his voice echoing in the small space. He waved his arms, kicked over a dining chair with a loud clatter, and swiped the decorative pillows from the sofa onto the floor. Elizabeth watched the entire performance with a strange, unnerving calm. When his chest was heaving and he had finally run out of breath, she spoke into the ringing silence. "Let's get a divorce." He froze, his arms falling to his sides. He looked like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Slowly, he righted the fallen chair and sank into it. "Liz, have you lost your mind? A divorce? We have children, a condo, a car payment. Have you thought this through at all?" A small, humourless smile touched her lips. "The children will be fine. I think they'll be better, actually. They can finally get a break from your screaming. The condo is ours jointly. We'll divide it. And that car loan you were so proud of, it's in your name alone, so don't involve me in it." His face flushed a deep mottled red, and a vein pulsed in his forehead. He leaned forward, hissing the words at her. "You'd better think this through. Who do you think is going to want you? Damaged goods with 2 kids. Don't come crawling back to me in 6 months, because I won't take you." She took a final sip of the cool tea she'd made earlier and stood up. "My daughters need me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And I need me. Healthy, calm and whole. With you, that's just not on the table. You're so poisoned by your own envy, you can't see anything straight. You swore you would change, and you've only gotten worse. Living with you has become unbearable." "I'm not letting you take this condo," You'll be left with nothing, you fool." "That will be for a judge to decide, not you," she said calmly, walking toward the door. "But, you know, I think a single recording of one of your tirades would be enough to make the court see things my way, and I happen to have one." She left him there, his mouth agape, as he tried to process what she'd just said. Elizabeth drove to her mother's, and from there she found a small rental apartment, a place paid for by the salary he so resented. She arranged to work from home, unwilling to see him before the divorce was final. Her mother called daily with updates. Mark had shown up at her house, as expected, with flowers and a rehearsed apology. When he found neither his wife nor his children, he erupted, shouting on the front porch until her mother, her own patience finally exhausted, called the police. He was escorted away with a fine for disturbing the peace. Mark hired a lawyer, determined to make good on his threats. But Elizabeth and her mother were prepared. In court they presented not only the chilling audio recording of his verbal abuse, but also the security camera footage from her mother's porch, which clearly showed him threatening them both. The outcome was decisive. The girls remained with their mother, the court ordered the condo sold and the assets divided equally. He was left with his car payment, and a new court-ordered child support payment he would be forced to pay. Elizabeth, like thousands of other women, had tried to step back into the river of her old life, only to find the current had grown toxic, its undertow threatening to pull her under for good. Now, standing on a new shore, with her daughter's hands in hers, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face. The water ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a very long time, she knew it was clean, and she was finally free to swim.